January 30th, 1944, Anzio, Italy. Inside a reinforced concrete bunker carved into the hillside, a German officer pressed his eye to an observation periscope. The walls around him were 4 feet thick, steel reinforced, rated to survive direct hits from the heaviest artillery the Allies were believed to possess. He was calm. He had been calm for months. Then the ground shuddered. Not the distant thump of shell fire, not the rolling thunder of a barrage. This was different. A single violent odor that felt less like an explosion and more like the earth itself being struck with a hammer. The periscope went white. Dust slammed through the bunker vents. The lights flickered, then steadied. When the smoke cleared, the bunker he had been watching was gone. Not damaged, not breached. Gone. Where an interlocking strongpoint had stood for 8 months, concrete, steel, men, equipment, there was now only a crater. No recognizable structure, no defensive value, just pulverized. Earth and silence. The officer lowered his pencil to paper and wrote a sentence that would later be found in German records. The Americans possess artillery of unimaginable power. What he did not yet understand was that this was not an isolated incident. It was the moment an entire way of war began to die. For generations, German military doctrine had treated fortifications as certainty. Concrete meant survival. Walls bought time. Bunkers were not just defensive structures. They were psychological anchors. Soldiers entered them believing they could endure anything short of direct annihilation. By 1944, the German army had perfected this belief. From Italy to France to the western border of the Reich, defensive lines were built around reinforced positions designed to absorb punishment. Artillery might damage them, bombs might shake them, but destroy them outright? That was considered unlikely, impractical, too expensive in ammunition and time. At Anzio, that assumption collapsed in seconds. The weapon responsible had fired from beyond visual range. There was no warning. No buildup, no creeping barrage. One round arrived and an entire bunker ceased to exist. The gun was called the M1 240mm howitzer. It had only just entered combat. At first, German commanders assumed this was an anomaly, an unlucky hit, a flaw in construction, a statistical outlier. Fortifications fail sometimes. Men are lost. War is unpredictable. Then it happened again. And again. Observation posts vanished, command bunkers collapsed inward, crews rated safe against months of bombardment were erased by single impacts. German prisoners began describing the shells in unnatural terms. Earthquake rounds, they called them, shells that made the ground ripple and breathe before killing everything inside it. More disturbing than the destruction itself was the precision. These were not saturation fires. The Americans were not blanketing hillsides or pounding areas into submission. Individual bunkers were being selected, targeted, and eliminated one by one. A position would exist in the morning. By afternoon, it was a crater. For the first time, German defenders began abandoning their strongest positions voluntarily, not because they had been overrun, but because they had been seen. What unnerved them most was not the size of the shell, but the idea that someone, somewhere, could identify their exact location and end it with mathematical certainty. This was not how fortification warfare was supposed to work. Bunkers were meant to slow the enemy, to force infantry assaults, to trade time for blood. They were meant to be endured, not erased. Yet at Anzio, reinforced concrete was no longer buying time. It was buying death. And this was only the beginning, because the weapon that shattered those bunkers was not a desperate improvisation or a one-off marvel. It was the deliberate product of American planning, built to solve a problem no other army had truly confronted. The Germans would soon discover that this gun was not meant to terrorize cities or flatten landscapes. It was designed to do something far worse. It was built to make fortresses obsolete. By the early years of the war, every major army understood the problem. Modern fortifications had changed the nature of defense. Reinforced concrete, steel rebar, buried positions, overlapping fields of fire. These were not the sandbag trenches of the First World War. They were engineered systems, designed to absorb punishment and keep fighting. Artillery could suppress them, bombers could shake them. But destroying them outright was another matter. Germany believed it had solved this problem through construction: thicker walls, deeper bunkers, stronger roofs. If concrete was strong enough, no gun could crack it quickly. Any attacker would be forced into costly infantry assaults, trading lives for meters. Other nations accepted this. Logic. The British relied on prolonged bombardment and air power. The Soviets answered fortifications with mass, overwhelming artillery fired in enormous volumes, hoping that something would eventually give. Both approaches worked sometimes, but always at a price: time, ammunition, casualties. The United States reached a different conclusion. American planners recognized that the real problem was not power. It was efficiency. If it took days of shelling to reduce a single bunker, the defender still controlled the battlefield. If a fortress could delay an advance long enough, it had already done its job, even if it eventually fell. What the U.S. Army wanted was something no other military had seriously pursued: a gun that did not need to flatten an area, a gun that could destroy a specific structure, one bunker, one command post, one fortified position, selected, targeted, and eliminated. Not with terror, not with volume, with certainty. This was not how artillery had traditionally been used. Artillery was meant to dominate space, to deny movement, to break formations. Precision was desirable, but not essential. What American ordnance officers proposed instead was radical. They wanted an artillery piece heavy enough to shatter reinforced concrete, but accurate enough to hit individual fortifications. Powerful, but controlled. Massive, yet mobile. A weapon that could be brought forward, set up, and used repeatedly, not once as a spectacle. No railway guns, no static siege engines. A system that could move with the army and solve the same problem over and over again. On paper, the requirements bordered on impossible. But American industry was not asked whether it was elegant. It was asked whether it was possible. And that question changed everything. The requirement the U.S. Army issued in 1940 did not sound ambitious. It sounded absurd. American ordnance officers were told to design a weapon capable of defeating modern European fortifications, the kind built into hillsides, reinforced with steel, and engineered to survive the heaviest artillery then in existence. That alone was difficult. But the gun also had to be mobile. It could not be mounted on rail cars like the giant weapons of the First World War. It could not require weeks of preparation or specialized infrastructure. It had to move on roads, be towed by military vehicles, and be emplaced close enough to the front to matter. It had to fire a shell heavy enough to smash through multiple feet of reinforced concrete, and it had to do so accurately. Not area accuracy, not saturation fire. Accuracy precise enough to place a round directly onto a specific bunker, command post, or observation position. All of this had to be achieved by a weapon that could be produced in large numbers, supplied with ammunition continuously, and operated repeatedly. Not as a one-time siege instrument, but as a routine battlefield tool. No army in the world had built such a system. Germany's answer to fortifications was larger fortifications. When more power was needed, the Germans turned to enormous railway guns, technological marvels that required days to prepare, massive crews, and predictable firing positions. The Soviets relied on mass. Thousands of guns firing together, accepting inaccuracy in exchange for overwhelming force. The British leaned on air power and prolonged bombardment. The American approach was different. Instead of asking how big a gun could be built, American planners asked how reliably a problem could be solved. They wanted a weapon that could arrive, be assembled, and fire with repeatable precision. One that could be used again tomorrow and the day after that, and again a week later, each time against a different target. The shell would have to do more than explode. It would need the weight and velocity to punch into concrete before detonating, to turn the bunker itself into the weapon that destroyed its occupants. The gun would have to absorb immense recoil without tearing itself apart. Its crew would have to load and fire it safely again and again under combat conditions. On paper, the system was enormous. In reality, it was walking a knife edge between power and control. Many believed it could not be done. But in the United States, The question was not whether the design violated tradition. It was whether factories, engineers, and logistics could make it real. And once that question was answered, the rest became inevitable. When the first American 240mm howitzers arrived at the Anzio beachhead, few German officers were alarmed. They had seen heavy guns before. They had endured naval shelling. They understood bombardment. What they believed they understood, above all else, was concrete. The German 14th Army had turned the hills around Anzio into a fortress. Observation bunkers crowned ridgelines. Command posts were buried deep into slopes. Each position was tied into a network designed to survive weeks of pressure. On January 30th, 1944, that confidence met reality. The American guns did not announce themselves with prolonged fire. There was no rolling barrage, no visible buildup. A forward observer identified a single German observation post overlooking the beachhead and transmitted its coordinates. Minutes later, a single shell arrived. The bunker vanished. The round had traveled more than 13 miles. It struck with such force that 4 feet of reinforced concrete collapsed inward, killing everyone inside instantly. The position that had dominated the surrounding terrain simply ceased to exist. German commanders demanded explanations. They received more evidence instead. Over the following days, American forward observers continued calling for fire, not on areas, but on specific structures. A command bunker here, an observation post there, each target selected deliberately, each strike calculated, each result unmistakable. German prisoners began describing the shells in the same way, again and again. They did not talk about explosions. They talked about the ground moving. They said the earth lifted, then crushed everything inside the bunkers. That, even near misses, caused walls to crack, ceilings to sag, and men to panic. Some refused to enter reinforced positions at all after witnessing a single impact. What unsettled German commanders most was not the size of the gun. It was the method. The Americans were not guessing. They were not firing blindly. The shells arrived with timing so precise that multiple guns could land their rounds almost simultaneously on a single target. A bunker could absorb 1 hit, sometimes even 2. But when several arrived within seconds, there was no survival. By the end of the Anzio campaign, the pattern was clear. American 240mm howitzers had engaged dozens of fortified positions. Most were destroyed outright. Others were abandoned by their crews, deemed more dangerous than the open ground outside. One German unit diary captured the shift in thinking with chilling simplicity. American super-heavy artillery makes our fortified positions untenable. For the first time, German soldiers understood that concrete no longer guaranteed safety. If they were identified, they were already dead. Anzio was not a fluke. It was a demonstration, and what it demonstrated was terrifying. The strongest defenses in Europe could now be removed, deliberately, efficiently, and one by one. The war had changed, and the Germans were only beginning to understand how badly. If Anzio planted fear, Monte Cassino destroyed belief. For months, the Gustav Line had stopped the Allied advance in Italy cold. Anchored on the ancient monastery above the Liri Valley, German paratroopers had transformed the surrounding mountains into one of the most formidable defensive systems in Europe. Concrete bunkers were carved directly into rock. Positions were hidden on reverse slopes, invisible from the air. Artillery fire rolled over them with little effect. Repeated infantry assaults collapsed under machine gun fire and mortars. Entire divisions bled against defenses that refused to break. Cassino became a symbol. If this line could not be cracked, Italy might never be taken. When American 240mm howitzers were brought forward in the spring of 1944, expectations were cautious. Cassino had resisted everything else. Bombers had leveled the monastery itself without breaking the positions beneath it. Conventional artillery had pounded the mountains for weeks. Then, the super-heavy guns began firing. Unlike earlier bombardments, the targets were not hillsides or general areas. Forward observers identified individual German strongpoints embedded in the slopes below the ruins. Each bunker was plotted, each firing solution calculated, each strike deliberate. When the shells hit, they did not glance off rock or scattered debris. They punched inward, concrete roofs collapsed, interior chambers imploded, shock waves traveled through the mountainside, snapping steel reinforcement and crushing everything inside. In several cases, bunkers that survived direct hits were abandoned anyway, their crews shaken beyond the ability to continue fighting. German paratroopers, some of the most disciplined soldiers in the Wehrmacht, began pulling back from positions they had held for months. They were not being overrun. They were being erased. British and American officers watching the bombardment understood what they were seeing. Fortifications that had consumed entire campaigns were being removed in hours. Positions that had cost thousands of lives to assault were being eliminated without infantry ever reaching them. One Allied commander later remarked that the American super heavy guns had achieved what months of bombing and artillery had failed to do. They made the defenders understand that resistance no longer made sense. For the Germans at Cassino, the realization was devastating. If fortifications cut into solid rock could not protect them, if reverse-slope bunkers offered no safety, then nowhere was truly defensible. The Gustav Line broke soon after, and with it, a core assumption of German defensive doctrine died quietly in the mountains of Italy. Concrete had reached its limit. What came next would prove that Cassino was not the exception. It was the warning. In Normandy, the Germans believed the terrain itself would protect them. The countryside around Saint-Lô was a defender's maze, hedgerows, sunken lanes, rolling hills, and narrow fields that broke up visibility and movement. German engineers had reinforced this natural advantage with concrete bunkers positioned on reverse slopes, invisible to air attack and shielded from direct fire. Many of these positions had survived everything the Allies could throw at them. Heavy bombers flattened. Towns without touching the bunkers beneath the hills. Conventional artillery saturated fields and roads while German crews waited safely behind concrete and earth. Infantry assaults stalled again and again, cut apart by defenders who seemed untouchable. To the Germans, these reverse-slope fortifications felt safe. They were wrong. When American 240mm howitzers were brought into action during the Normandy breakout, the pattern seen in Italy repeated itself, but with unsettling speed. Forward observers moved with the advancing infantry, identifying bunkers that had survived air raids and massed artillery. Coordinates were passed back. Minutes later, the ground answered. The shells did not need a direct line of sight. Fired at high angles, they rose out of view, then dropped almost vertically onto positions the Germans believed immune. When they struck, the earth itself became the weapon. Shock waves traveling through soil and concrete, collapsing bunkers even when the impact landed just meters away. In several cases, German crews were killed without ever seeing the shell that destroyed them. What followed was not just physical destruction, but a rapid psychological collapse. Elite formations, units that had fought for months without retreat, began abandoning prepared positions. Not because they were overwhelmed, but because they knew what happened to bunkers once they were identified. Survivors described a new kind of fear. Artillery could be endured, bombing could be endured, but this was different. These strikes were deliberate, personal. A bunker did not die by chance, it was selected. One German officer later admitted that the worst moment was not the explosion itself, but the waiting. The knowledge that someone was watching, calculating, and that escape was no longer possible once fire was called. For the Americans, the effect was decisive. Positions that had stalled entire divisions were eliminated without costly assaults. Infantry advanced through terrain once considered lethal, finding collapsed bunkers and abandoned strongpoints instead of resistance. Normandy demonstrated something Cassino had only hinted at. Terrain no longer mattered. Reverse slopes no longer mattered. Camouflage no longer mattered. If a fortified position could be located, it could be destroyed. And once that reality set in, the German defensive system began to unravel, not from lack of courage, but from the loss of faith. Because a bunker that could be seen was already dead. The Siegfried Line was not just a defensive position, it was an idea. Stretching for hundreds of miles along Germany's western frontier, it represented decades of military thought, a belief that concrete, steel, and preparation could halt any enemy long enough to make victory impossible. Thousands of bunkers, pillboxes, and fortified positions were poured into the landscape, each one built to absorb punishment and hold ground. German soldiers trusted it. They were meant to. The line had been designed to survive prolonged siege, to bleed an attacker dry while buying time for counterattacks and negotiation. It was the final expression of Germany's faith in static defense. When American forces reached it in the autumn of 1944, many German commanders believed that, whatever had happened in Italy or France, this would be different. It was not. As American infantry probed forward, forward observers followed close behind. The pattern was already familiar. Fortified positions were identified, coordinates transmitted, calculations made. Then, the 240mm shells arrived. Bunkers rated to withstand days of bombardment collapsed after a handful of impacts. Some were destroyed outright, others cracked, caved in, or were shaken so violently that their crews fled rather than wait for the next round. German war diaries began recording a grim realization. Fixed fortifications no longer concentrated protection, they concentrated casualties. Positions that had taken months to construct were erased in hours. Entire defensive sectors were neutralized not by frontal assault, but by methodical destruction, one bunker at a time, selected and eliminated with precision. The psychological effect spread faster than the physical damage. Word traveled along the line. Soldiers learned what happened when a bunker was targeted. They learned that overhead cover no longer meant survival, that concrete roofs could collapse inward without warning, that a structure meant to save their lives could kill them instantly. Some units attempted adaptation, camouflage improved, dummy positions were built, troops dispersed when possible. But none of it solved the core problem. If a position was located, it could be destroyed, and American artillery could fire again tomorrow. By late 1944, German defensive doctrine quietly reversed itself. Orders emphasized mobility over fortification, shallow. Field positions replaced deep bunkers. Survival meant movement, not shelter. It was an admission that would have been unthinkable years earlier. The Siegfried Line had not been breached by mass assault. It had been made irrelevant. What collapsed along Germany's western border was not just concrete and steel. It was a way of thinking. And once that belief was gone, the road into the heart of the Reich lay open. The 240mm howitzer was terrifying on its own. But what truly broke German resistance was not the gun. It was the fact that there were more of them and that they never stopped firing. Germany could build formidable weapons. It could design massive guns and pour enormous effort into individual marvels of engineering. But those weapons were rare, slow to deploy, and fragile in practice. They were solutions meant to impress, not systems meant to endure. The American approach was colder. The M1 240mm howitzer was not built as a wonder weapon. It was built to be produced, transported, supplied, and fired again and again. Once factories began turning them out, the logic of the battlefield changed. A single gun was dangerous. Dozens supplied indefinitely were unstoppable. Each shell weighed hundreds of pounds. Each required precision forging, careful machining, and reliable fuses. Delivering them to the front demanded a vast logistical network, ships, trucks, fuel, crews, maintenance teams, all operating continuously under combat conditions. And that network never failed. American artillery units could expend enormous quantities of ammunition without hesitation. A fortified position did not survive simply because the attacker ran out of shells or time. If a bunker resisted, more rounds followed. If a position was abandoned, the guns shifted to the next target. German commanders understood the implication. This was not a weapon they could wait out. They could not force the Americans to conserve ammunition. They could not destroy the supply chain fast enough. They could not rebuild fortifications faster than they were being eliminated. The terror was not in the explosion. It was in the certainty. American industry had turned precision into a permanent condition of the battlefield. The guns would be there tomorrow, and the day after that, and the next week. A defensive system designed to delay an enemy collapses when delay becomes impossible. And once that truth was understood, resistance lost its meaning. By late 1944, German soldiers no longer spoke about American artillery as a weapon. They spoke about it as a condition, something that could not be escaped, negotiated with, or endured, something that arrived not through chance, but through process. Captured German reports began using the same language again and again. Fortified positions were described as untenable. Bunkers were no longer shelters, they were traps. Casualties from single shells exceeded those from entire days of conventional bombardment. The most disturbing realization was simple. There was no countermeasure. Camouflage could delay detection, but not prevent it. Dummy positions could mislead observers briefly, but once a real bunker fired, it revealed itself. Dispersion reduced losses until the artillery adjusted, and adjustment was constant. American forward observers moved with the infantry, calling fire from positions miles away. Fire direction centers calculated solutions in minutes. Shells arrived with precision that felt personal to those on the receiving end. German veterans later described the waiting as the worst part. Once a position was identified, there was nothing to do but wait. Running often meant death. Staying meant collapse. Some units abandoned fortifications preemptively, choosing open ground over concrete roofs they no longer trusted. Morale disintegrated. A defensive doctrine built on endurance failed when endurance no longer mattered. Fortifications were supposed to delay the enemy long enough to change the outcome of the war. But delay meant nothing against an opponent who could afford infinite patience and infinite ammunition. German commanders understood the arithmetic. They could not outbuild the destruction. They could not outlast the supply chain. And they could not fight a weapon that improved with every engagement. The fear spread faster than the shells. Entire sectors withdrew, not because they had been destroyed, but because they knew they would be. Resistance shifted from defense to survival. Orders emphasized movement, concealment, and retreat, anything except remaining inside a bunker once American super-heavy artillery appeared. This was not defeat in the traditional sense. It was the collapse of belief. Belief that concrete could save them. Belief that preparation guaranteed survival. Belief that there were limits the enemy could not cross. By the time American forces approached the Rhine, those beliefs were gone. And without them, the war's outcome was no longer in doubt. The physical destruction was easy to measure. Thousands of bunkers, pillboxes, and fortified positions vanished under the relentless fire of American super-heavy artillery. German defenders, once confident in their concrete fortresses, were forced to scatter. Some fled their positions, others chose surrender, and some simply refused to fight any longer. But the true cost was not in the rubble. It was in the minds of those who survived. For the German soldiers, the terror of the 240mm howitzers was not simply the explosion, the ground-shaking force, or the violent collapse of their defenses. It was the knowledge that their positions were no longer safe, that concrete could no longer guarantee survival. It was the waiting, the helplessness, the certainty that if their location was identified, they would not live to see the next minute. German veterans, years after the war, would admit that this psychological impact was what broke them. The constant fear that there was nowhere to hide, that even the strongest positions would be obliterated with ruthless precision, shattered their will to resist. Post-war interviews with soldiers who had served on the Western Front often revealed the depth of this trauma. Many survivors, particularly those who had endured the siege of the Siegfried Line and the relentless bombardment of the Rhine, struggled with PTSD. They spoke of nightmares, recurring visions of bunkers collapsing, and the overwhelming sensation that nowhere was ever truly safe again. The fear of American artillery became ingrained in their psyche. One veteran recalled, "We never knew when it would come, and when it did, it was always too late to run." But the psychological trauma did not belong to the Germans alone. American forward observers, too, carried the weight of their actions. They had called for these strikes, identified targets, and watched as their shells destroyed entire crews. The horror of knowing that each successful mission meant dozens of enemy soldiers, perhaps even civilians, lost forever, took its toll on them as well. The psychological scars of war ran deep on both sides. But for the German defenders, the defining moment was not the physical destruction of their positions. It was the loss of faith, the realization that their once indomitable fortifications were now the instruments of their own undoing. When the Allies crossed the Rhine in 1945, the final days of the war came not from a battle of military might, but from a collapse of morale, a collapse that had been years in the making and that had been hastened by a weapon that did not just destroy bunkers, it destroyed certainty itself. The M1 240mm howitzer did more than change battlefield tactics. It changed the very nature of warfare. Its precision, backed by unmatched industrial production, rendered entire defensive doctrines obsolete. Fortifications that had withstood centuries of military theory were erased in a matter of hours, and with them, the belief that any position was safe, that concrete and steel could protect against the might of American industry. For the Allies, the howitzer symbolized the unstoppable force of industrial might. It wasn't just the weapons power that mattered, but the knowledge that more would come again and again until the enemy had nothing left to hide behind. For the Germans, the 240mm howitzer was a revelation. It was a weapon that did not just destroy, it shattered their sense of security, their sense of strategy, their very belief in the unbreakable strength of their fortifications. And once that belief collapsed, so did their defense. The howitzer's legacy endured far beyond the war itself. It proved that in modern industrial warfare, there is no position that cannot be destroyed, no bunker that cannot become a tomb. And in doing so, it changed how the world viewed the nature of defense and the terrifying efficiency of industrial warfare.